What if the very people who captivate us most, the magnetic leaders, the persuasive speakers, the ones who light up a room the moment they enter, are also the ones most likely to lead us into danger? What if the charm that draws us in is not a blessing, but a veil thin, shimmering, seductive, hiding something far more complicated, even sinister? We like to believe we are rational beings, guided by reason, logic, and evidence, but the truth is, we are creatures of emotion, of instinct, of subconscious yearnings we often don't fully understand. And few forces in the human world are more hypnotic, more irresistible, than charisma. Charisma is not merely confidence or eloquence. It's a psychological phenomenon, a dance between the one who emits it and the one who receives it. It makes us feel seen, understood, even loved. It bends our judgments. It distorts our sense of safety and danger, right and wrong. But where does this power come from? And what happens when it's wielded without conscience? Imagine a man standing on a podium, his voice steady, his eyes ablaze with conviction. He doesn't ask you to believe, he makes you feel foolish not to. He doesn't speak to your mind, he speaks to your soul. Bypassing logic entirely, you find yourself nodding. Even before you've processed his words, you feel emboldened, inspired, maybe even transformed. But something unsettling stirs beneath the surface. You don't notice it at first, because the intoxication of charisma is so complete. History is littered with figures like this, voices that moved nations, yet led them into ruin. We are told to be wary of tyrants, of ideologues, of manipulators in dark alleys, but the most dangerous figures often don't look dangerous at all. They smile, they charm, they flatter, they seem to understand us in ways even our closest friends don't. And that is the most dangerous illusion of all. Charisma is a mirror. It reflects what we most want to see: strength, hope, certainty. In uncertain times, that certainty becomes a lifeline. We cling to it, even if it drags us into deep waters. Consider the rise of certain political leaders, religious figures, even CEOs and influencers. Their power doesn't come from policies, plans, or spreadsheets. It comes from the spell they cast, the emotional tether that binds them to their followers. Rational critique bounces off them like rain off a slick coat. They don't need to be right. They just need to be compelling. But why do we fall for it? It begins in the brain. Our evolutionary wiring prioritizes confidence and coherence. We are social creatures, hardwired to follow those who appear to lead. Our ancestors survived by aligning with dominant individuals. Back then, it meant safety. Today, it often means surrendering our autonomy. We tell ourselves we're immune, that we'd never follow blindly, but blind faith rarely feels blind. It feels like illumination. The charismatic figure doesn't command, they awaken. You feel awakened, even chosen. You think more clearly, feel more alive. But that clarity is often borrowed, not built. And the moment we outsource our thinking to someone else, no matter how inspiring they seem, we begin the slow descent into manipulation. There's something almost spiritual about the way we respond to charismatic personalities. It mirrors devotion, the fervor of a political rally, the ecstasy of a religious revival, to the hysteria at a concert. It's the same underlying force. It bypasses intellect and plugs directly into emotion. The leader becomes not just a person but a symbol. And when someone becomes a symbol, they become immune to criticism. You don't question symbols, you revere them. You protect them. This is why the charismatic can be so dangerous. Not because they are inherently evil, but because they often cease to be human in the eyes of their followers, and when someone becomes more than human, they are no longer held to human standards. They can disappoint, deceive, even destroy and still be followed, because followers aren't seeing a person, they're seeing an ideal, and ideals don't bleed. Think of the movements that started with passion and ended in tragedy, cults that promised salvation, regimes that promised rebirth, revolutions that devoured their own. They all began with a voice that didn't just speak, but seduced. And when things began to unravel, few could admit it, because to question the leader was to question themselves, and that's often too painful to bear. Even in everyday life, the charismatic can hold disproportionate power. In the workplace, they rise quickly, not always because they're the most competent, but because they're the most captivating. In relationships, they may be adored before they are truly known. And in these contexts, charisma can become a mask, a beautiful one, but a mask nonetheless. Behind it, there may be empathy, or there may be narcissism, but we won't know until it's too late. Charismatic people often learn early that they possess a certain gravity. They see how rooms shift when they enter, how people lean in when they speak, and some use that power responsibly, with humility and self-awareness, but others become addicted to it. Power, after all, is the most intoxicating drug of all, and charisma is its gateway. The danger lies not just in the person, but in the dynamic they create. A charismatic leader can inspire greatness, but also obedience. They can mobilize change, but also silence dissent. Because once people are under the spell, they don't just follow, they defend. Even against truth, even against conscience. You've seen it. The friend who refuses to acknowledge the toxicity of a partner, the employee who rationalizes the unethical behavior of a boss, the citizen who excuses the cruelty of a leader. They are not stupid. They are ensnared. Charisma doesn't destroy through force. It seduces through affection. And the seduction works both ways. The charismatic figure often believes their own myth. They begin to think they are as good, as wise, as necessary as their followers believe. This is the breeding ground for megalomania. And once someone believes they are infallible, that they alone can fix it, save it, lead it, the collapse becomes inevitable. But here's the twist. The danger is not just in being led by charisma, it's in craving it. We want to be moved. We want to feel alive. And charisma gives us that spark. But sparks, left unchecked, become fires. And fires, though beautiful, consume everything in their path. So what do? Do we reject charisma altogether? Do we distrust anyone who inspires us? Of course not. Inspiration is necessary. Leadership is vital. But the antidote to blind charisma is conscious awareness. To be aware of the spell, even as you feel it. To admire without surrendering. To question. Even when the answers feel good, it requires discipline to ask yourself, do I agree? Or do I just feel good agreeing? It requires courage to say no to someone everyone else says yes to. And above all, it requires humility. The humility to admit that we, too, can be swayed, that we are not above the pull. Only then can we engage with charisma without being consumed by it. In the end, perhaps the question is not whether someone is charismatic, but whether they are accountable, not whether they move us, but whether they ground us, not whether they inspire belief, but whether they encourage thought, Because true leadership doesn't just dazzle, it invites, it challenges, it evolves. So the next time someone makes your heart race with their words, the next time you feel lifted, stirred, even awakened by their presence, pause. Ask yourself what lies beneath the surface. Is it truth, or merely a reflection of your own longing? And are you following them because of what they see in you, or because of what you hope to see in them? Charisma is not evil, but it is power, and power, unchecked, always demands a cost. The most dangerous leaders are not those who make you afraid. They are those who make you feel safe, too safe to question, too awed to doubt. And that is where the real danger begins. Because when we stop thinking for ourselves, when we let another's voice replace our own inner compass, when we trade discernment for devotion, we don't just lose our freedom, we lose our future. And by the time the spell breaks, the damage may already be done. So stay awake, stay discerning, and above all, stay free. But staying free in a world that rewards charm over character is no easy feat. We live in an era where image is currency, where a well-delivered sentence can outshine decades of hard-earned truth, and where the line between authentic influence and seductive performance is often invisible. Charisma, in its modern form, is no longer just a personal trait, it is a weaponized commodity. It's been packaged, polished, monetized. Social media thrives on it. Politicians depend on it. Movements are born from it. And sometimes, people are destroyed by it. Scroll through your feed, and you'll see them, the voices that cut through the noise, the eyes that hold your gaze, the messages that stir something you didn't even know needed stirring. They seem confident, articulate, emotionally attuned. But behind the filter, behind the lighting, behind the curated story, is there integrity or simply strategy? Charisma, when divorced from ethics, becomes a mask for manipulation. And manipulation rarely looks evil when it's cloaked in inspiration. In fact, some of the most destructive figures in history didn't come with horns and fire. They came with vision, with promise, with hope. They offered not tyranny, but transformation. And people, desperate for change, handed over their trust. It's in that transaction, trust for transformation, that the real seduction begins. Because transformation sounds noble, it feels righteous. But not all transformation is progress. Sometimes, it's decay dressed as evolution. Sometimes, the leader who promises to liberate you is the very one building the cage. And yet, we return to them over and over again. Why? Because they give us something reality rarely does: simplicity. A clear story, a villain to blame, a path to salvation. In a world of complexity, uncertainty, and moral ambiguity, the charismatic personality offers a soothing illusion that someone else can carry the burden of thinking for us. And let's be honest, thinking deeply, critically, painfully is exhausting. Questioning our assumptions, facing uncomfortable truths, wrestling with doubt, it's far easier to hand the reins to someone who seems to know what they're doing. But here's the bitter truth: the moment we do that, we stop growing, we stop learning, we become passengers in a vehicle we don't control, driven by someone we barely know. It's not just leaders who can carry this dangerous charisma. It can be found in lovers, teachers, mentors, celebrities, people we look up to, people we let in. And sometimes, they don't even know the power they hold. They charm without trying. They influence without intent. But the impact is the same. our judgments bend, our doute soften. We let them make decisions, not because they are right, but because they feel right, and then come the blind spots, the red flags we excuse, the contradictions we ignore. We say, "They didn't mean it," or "You just don't understand them like I do." We rationalize, we defend, and all the while, our intuition, that quiet internal voice, gets buried beneath the noise of adoration. This is how relationships become prisons. This is how institutions become cults. This is how movements lose their way, not in a flash of tyranny, but in a slow erosion of accountability, enabled by people who love the leader too much to see them clearly. But the most insidious danger is this: when we internalize the charismatic figure's voice as our own, when we hear their beliefs echo in our heads and mistake it for independent thought, when we begin to filter the world not through our own perception, but through their lens, that is the death of discernment. That is the beginning of ideological possession, and yet we crave it. We crave the certainty they bring, the confidence they exude, because deep down, we are all searching for something, for meaning, for belonging, for direction. Charismatic personalities offer a shortcut. They make us feel less alone. They say the words we've been longing to hear, and in that emotional transaction, we become theirs, not by force, but by choice. But what if we took that desire, our hunger for meaning, for clarity, for connection, and turned it inward? What if, instead of following the voice that stirs us, we cultivated our own? What if we stopped outsourcing our integrity and started building it from within? Because the truth is, the only immunity to toxic charisma is inner alignment. When you know who you are, you're less likely to be told who to be. When you think critically, you're less likely to be coerced emotionally. When you value truth over comfort, you're less likely to be seduced by beautiful lies. And yet, this is not a call for cynicism. It's not about distrusting everyone who inspires you. It's about developing the strength to admire without worshipping, to be moved without being manipulated, to recognize that the most trustworthy leaders are often the ones who don't demand your loyalty, but your independence, because true influence does not ask for obedience. It invites collaboration. It does not demand belief. It earns respect. And when you find someone who encourages your growth rather than your dependence, who challenges your assumptions rather than exploiting them, you've found something rare. Someone who leads not from ego, but from essence. The real danger of charismatic personalities is not that they exist, it's that we don't know how to engage with them consciously. We either fall for them blindly or reject them entirely. But there is a third way: discernment, the ability to see both the light and the shadow, to feel the pull without losing your grounding, to be inspired without being hypnotized. Because in the end, charisma is just a tool, a powerful one. Yes, but like any tool, its value depends on how it's used. In the hands of the wise, it uplifts. In the hands of the hungry, it controls. And in the hands of the self-deceived, it destroys. So don't be afraid of charisma, but be awake to it. Study it. Understand its effects on you. Ask yourself not just how someone makes you feel, but why. What need are they touching? What wound are they soothing? What longing are they awakening? And above all, remember this: the most important voice in your life should not be the one that sounds the most confident, the most magnetic, the most eloquent. It should be the one that teaches you to think better, to feel deeper, to question more honestly, the one that helps you become more of yourself, not less. Because the greatest danger of charisma is forgetting who you are in the presence of someone who makes you feel like you've finally been found. But to truly understand the grip charisma holds over us, we must confront something even deeper, our own yearning to believe in something bigger, someone better. In moments of crisis, chaos, or even quête de satisfaction, we don't just want direction, we crave revelation. We long for that person who speaks with certainty when we are drowning in doubt, who smiles with assurance while our world trembles beneath uncertainty. Charisma feeds that longing. It doesn't solve the problem, it makes us forget we had one. And so we follow, not because we are weak, but because we are human, vulnerable, emotional, meaning-seeking creatures. And charismatic figures, knowingly or not, become vessels for that meaning. We project onto them, we fill in the gaps with our own hopes, and they, in turn, to begin to embody something they never entirely were, to begin with perfection, salvation, destiny. This is where the spiral begins. The more we invest in someone's charisma, the harder it becomes to see their flaws. And if we do glimpse them, we reinterpret them as signs of depth, mystery, or misunderstood genius. He's complicated. We say, she's passionate. But complexity is not a license for cruelty. Passion is not a shield for deception. Yet, we excuse, again and again, because the cost of disillusionment is often greater than the price of continued belief. Admitting that we were fooled doesn't just shake our trust in them, it shakes our trust in ourselves. And so we double down. We defend harder. We follow further, even if the road leads nowhere. Or worse, somewhere dangerous. Think of the whistleblowers who spoke out against charismatic leaders. The ones who said, "Something's wrong." They were often not believed. Not because they lacked evidence, but because their truth threatened the emotional security of those still under the spell. It's not facts that break the spell of charisma. It's pain. Personal. Indéniable. Often devastating pain. But must it always come to that? Must the illusion shatter through heartbreak or betrayal before we see clearly? Not if we begin practicing something rare in the age of influence, inner vigilance. Not paranoia. Not fear. But an ongoing dialogue with ourselves. What am I feeling? Why am I drawn to this person? Am I being led? Or am I simply being seen? The distinction matters, because being seen can be healing. It can help us feel less alone. But when that feeling is mistaken for divine connection, when admiration turns into spiritual dependency, we relinquish something sacred, our own sovereignty. And sovereignty matters not just politically, but psychologically. It is the right to think, to feel, to choose for ourselves. A truly wise leader reinforces that right. A dangerous one subtly erodes it, cloaking control in the language of care. This is the tactic of the charismatic abuser. They don't need to raise their voice. They simply shift the emotional ground beneath you. They create dependency by wrapping manipulation in warmth, dominance in concern. I'm doing this for you, they say, and we believe it until we begin to disappear inside the version of ourselves they require. You don't see the erosion at first. It's slow, elegant, but it's easy. A suggestion here, a redirection there, a compliment that binds, a silence that punishes. And soon, you find yourself adjusting, appeasing, even apologizing for being too independent, too questioning. To you, this is how charismatic relationships, whether personal or public, become cages. The bars are built from emotion, and the lock is self-doubt. You no longer ask, "Is this right?" you ask, What would they want? You don't think about truth. You think about approval. And the tragedy is that many charismatic figures don't set out to control. They simply enjoy being needed. And when that need becomes mutual, when your identity becomes their mirror, a toxic symbiosis forms. You feed their ego. They feed your longing. Both feel vital. But neither is free. Freedom requires friction. The friction of disagreement. The friction of individuality. A truly empowering presence makes space for that. They do not panic when challenged. They do not punish dissent. They welcome it. Because they are not afraid of being wrong, or of you being whole. But when charisma becomes brittle, when it cannot tolerate contradiction, run. That is no longer inspiration. That is ideology. And ideologies with a face, a name, a voice that tolerates no deviation, will always collapse into control. We forget sometimes that the most enduring truths are not shouted, they are whispered within. The most meaningful guidance doesn't override it, aligns. And the most powerful leaders are not those who make you follow, but those who make you remember that you never needed to. So when you next feel the pull of someone's charisma, the rush of admiration, the flush of certainty, pause. Sit with it, feel it fully, then ask, is this admiration? Or is it surrender? Am I expanding or vanishing? Because when all is said and done, the cost of charisma unchecked is not just misplaced trust or broken faith. It is a subtle, silent death of self, one choice at a time, one uncompromised value, one ignored instinct, until you look in the mirror and see a stranger staring back. And the hardest part, that stranger might still be smiling, still repeating the words that once moved you, still echoing the charisma that once set your soul on fire. But there's a chill behind the warmth now, a distance behind the eyes, and the fire no longer warms, it burns. But the tragedy isn't just in the fading of self. It's in how quietly it happens. You don't wake up one day and realize you've been overtaken. It happens in the pauses between your convictions, in the small silences when you would have once spoken. It happens when you defer instead of decide. When you hesitate to question, not because you agree, but because you fear the cost of disloyalty. And loyalty, when tethered to charisma instead of character, becomes a prison dressed in devotion. There's a reason we're drawn to figures who seem larger than life. They give us permission to dream beyond our limits, to rise above the noise of our own hesitation. But no one should ever become too large to be questioned. Reverence, unchecked, calcifies into dogma. And dogma, when protected by emotional attachment, can justify anything. Look back through time, and you'll see this pattern repeated like an ancient rhythm. From the spiritual leaders who led their followers into isolation, to the political revolutionaries who became tyrants cloaked in the language of liberation, to the corporate icons who inspired millions only to exploit the very trust they cultivated, charisma was always there. Not as a weapon, but as a key to the inner sanctum of belief, belonging, identity. And once someone has the key to your belief, they can unlock your values. Once they hold your sense of belonging, they can reshape your behavior. And once they possess your identity, they can rewrite your future, all without you realizing it's being written for you. What's most disturbing is that this doesn't require cruelty. It doesn't require malicious intent. Often, the charismatic don't even see what they're doing. They feel loved, respected, admired, and who among us wouldn't be tempted to protect that, to nurture it, to keep it alive? But when admiration becomes dependence, when applause becomes insulation from accountability, then even the well-meaning can become dangerous. And it's here that we find one of the darkest truths. Charisma doesn't just blind the followers, it blinds the leaders too. It convinces them they're indispensable, that their instincts are truth, that their desires are destiny. Surrounded by admiration, they mistake reflection for reality. They begin to see themselves not as people, but as purpose. This is why some of the most charismatic individuals fall hardest, because they rise on a wave of projection, others' hopes, fears, fantasies, and that wave, while elating, is unstable. The moment they slip, the same crowd that worshipped them may turn disillusioned, even enraged. The higher the pedestal, the more devastating the fall. But even then, not all followers let go. Some cling tighter, desperate to protect the version of the person they once believed in. They rewrite the story. They deny the facts. They call betrayal persecution, because to admit they were wrong is to unravel the very meaning they've built their identity around. So the lie grows. The story mutates. The truth becomes dangerous not because it's false, but because it threatens the emotional architecture of belief. And in that space, darkness flourishes. But what if we did something different? What if, instead of vilifying charisma or surrendering to it, we simply learned to hold it lightly? What if we trained ourselves not just to think critically, but to feel critically, to notice when we're being swept away, to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty, to slow down when something feels too good to question? Because not all charisma is toxic. There are those who lead with integrity, who inspire without controlling, who listen more than they speak. They don't demand your loyalty, they earn your trust. They don't present themselves as perfect, they show their process. They remind you not of their greatness, but of your own potential, and perhaps that is the greatest distinction of all. The false charismatic makes you believe they are the answer. The true leader makes you realize you've always had the questions. So maybe it's time we stop asking who to follow and start asking how to follow, how to admire without surrender, how to question without hating, how to listen without losing ourselves. Because the danger isn't just in the one who speaks, it's in the silence of those who stop thinking. The moment we trade reflection for reaction, depth for devotion, independence for infatuation, that's when charisma ceases to inspire and begins to consume. And make no mistake, it will consume, not in a blaze, but in a slow, quiet, subtle erosion of the soul, until one day, you realize your voice doesn't sound like yours anymore. Your thoughts don't feel like yours. Your choices aren't coming from within, but from some distant echo that once felt like truth. And when that day comes, the tragedy won't just be what you've lost. It'll be how willingly you gave it away. But here's the cruel irony: most who are consumed by charisma never realize they've been hollowed out. Not because they're foolish, but because the experience feels so affirming. It feels like awakening, not erosion. The charismatic presence doesn't strip you of self all at once. It replaces you, piece by piece, with a more agreeable version of you, one that fits more easily into their narrative, one that questions less, one that blends in with the other believers. And so, when you look around, everyone is nodding. Everyone is smiling. Everyone is certain. And in the warmth of that agreement, the silence of your unease is easy to ignore. We mistake that warmth for truth. But warmth, while comforting, can also be the glow of a fire we should never have gotten close to. Because sometimes what we interpret as safety is simply sedation. A charismatic figure can cradle us into compliance, not with chains, but with certainty, not with fear, but with familiarity. And this is why charisma is such a dangerous form of power, because it does not need to threaten to control. It only needs to comfort, Most forms of power require effort. Enforcement. But charisma, it enlists your will. It turns you into its own enforcer. You begin to police yourself. You begin to defend them before they ask. You begin to attack dissent. Not because you're told to, but because the voice you've merged with cannot afford to be questioned. It is the ultimate illusion of freedom, feeling like you're choosing, when in fact, your choices have already been narrowed. Feeling like you're thinking, when your thoughts have already been framed. Feeling like you're following because you believe, when in fact, you believe because you've been following. And yet, the remedy is not to withdraw from influence altogether. We are social beings. We need inspiration. We need guidance. We need voices that lift us beyond the limits of our own experience. But we must learn to distinguish between a voice that points to the horizon and one that makes itself the destination, between a guide and a gatekeeper, between influence that invites growth and influence that demands surrender, because surrender, once habitual, becomes addictive. It offers relief from responsibility, and that relief, while seductive, is the beginning of moral numbness. You stop checking for right or wrong. You start checking for approval or rejection. And once approval becomes your compass, you are no longer guided by values, you are guided by the mood of your master. And masters don't always come with cruelty. Sometimes they come with tenderness. Sometimes, the most dangerous ones are not the angry, authoritarian types, but the soft, empathic ones who wrap their manipulation in care, who convince you that questioning them would be hurting them, that disagreeing with them is a betrayal of love. This is how people are controlled without ever feeling controlled. This is how freedom erodes behind the banner of connection, because the prison built by affection is far more resilient than one built by force, in a world where we are starving for intimacy, attention, and affirmation. The charismatic personality often arrives as a feast, but not everything that nourishes us is meant to last. Some meals are meant to addict, not to sustain. So, what does it mean to resist charisma without rejecting inspiration? It means developing a spine alongside your heart. It means honoring your gut when something doesn't feel right, even if it sounds beautiful. It means staying curious, even when someone seems certain. It means remembering that the best leaders leave you with more questions, not fewer. And if you find yourself drawn deeply to someone so deeply that their voice begins to replace your own pause, not to punish them, but to protect you, ask yourself, do I still know how to disagree with them? Can I walk away? If I choose to, have I tested their ideas against reality? Or just against my longing? Because longing can be a dangerous mirror. It shows you not what is, but what you hope to find. And the charismatic know how to step into that reflection. They don't become who they are. They become who you need them to be. And the more they fulfill your need, the less you notice the price you're paying. The worst part, the longer it goes on, the harder it is to walk away. Not because you are trapped, but because the illusion has become too precious. You've built a story around them, and around who you are with them. To leave them feels like erasing yourself, but staying, you slowly become someone you no longer recognize. And this is where so many get stuck in the limbo between awareness and action, between seeing the truth and being ready to live by it, because the truth, when it threatens the world we've built, often doesn't feel liberating. It feels cruel. And the pain of waking up is sometimes worse than the comfort of the dream. But there's something stronger than comfort, something deeper than admiration, something more enduring than the illusion of certainty, and that is integrity. The quiet voice inside you that whispers not what's easy, but what's right, not what's charming, But what's true, and if you listen closely, you'll hear it, even in the loudest storm of charisma. It may be faint at first, but it's there, waiting, calling you back to yourself. And when you return to yourself, truly return, you begin to see everything differently. The same words that once moved you now feel rehearsed. The same gestures that once thrilled you now seem calculated. The charisma that once pulled you in now feels like a current trying to carry you somewhere you never intended to go. And in that moment of clarity, painful as it may be, you realize you were never looking for a leader. You were looking for a reflection, for a sense of wholeness, for someone that could make you feel complete, but no one can complete you. No voice, no vision, no magnetic presence can do the work that belongs to your own soul. Charisma may awaken something in you, but it cannot replace the journey. It cannot walk the path for you. It cannot build your principles, sharpen your insight, or strengthen your resolve. Only you can do that. The danger of charisma isn't in its presence, it's in our surrender to it. In the way we mistake resonance for truth, in the way we allow someone else's conviction to eclipse our own discernment, in the way we trade nuance for clarity, complexity for certainty, autonomy for belonging. But there is another way, a harder way, a slower, quieter, more demanding way. It's the path of deliberate engagement, where you allow yourself to be moved but not swept away, where you admire deeply but never blindly, where you ask hard questions even when the answers threaten your sense of comfort, where you recognize that those who are most worthy of your trust are often the ones who invite your skepticism. And sometimes, walking this path means standing alone. It means turning away from the crowd, even when the crowd is celebrating what you've begun to question. It means risking disapproval, misunderstanding, even isolation, because the moment you stop echoing the collective awe, the spell begins to crack for you. And perhaps for others too, but that crack is not a loss. It's an opening, a space for truth to enter, a space for growth to begin. Because what lies on the other side of charisma isn't cynicism, it's clarity. The clarity to see people as they are, not as we wish them to be. The clarity to value authenticity over allure, depth over dazzle, alignment over approval. You begin to recognize a different kind of power, the quiet strength of those who do not need to be adored to stand firm, the rare presence of those who lead not with performance, but with principle, those who can hold their ground without taking yours away, those who don't need you to believe in them but want you to believe in yourself. And perhaps that is the ultimate sign of a trustworthy voice, not how much you want to follow them, but how much they help you follow your own truth, not how inspired you feel in their presence, but how empowered you feel in their absence. Because real leadership doesn't create dependence, it creates independence. It doesn't silence you, it strengthens you. So the next time you are stirred by someone's presence, take a moment. Ask not just what they're saying, but what they're doing with your attention. Ask whether their power comes from your awakening or your silence. Ask whether they are building something real in you or merely building themselves through you. And if the answer is hard to face, don't turn away. Lean into the discomfort. Let it teach you. Let it sharpen your vision. Let it restore the part of you that knows. Deep down, that truth doesn't need to be dazzling to be real. That integrity may not be magnetic, but it is lasting. That your soul recognizes what your mind sometimes forgets. The voice you most need to follow is the one that helps you come home to yourself. Because in the end, charisma fades, applause dies down, the stage empties, but you, your choices, your conscience, your clarity remain. And that, more than any speech or spotlight, is where your freedom lives. And when that freedom finally takes root, it changes everything. You no longer seek leaders to save you, you seek principles to guide you. You no longer crave affirmation from the stage, you find quiet conviction in the mirror. You begin to notice the difference between charisma that elevates and charisma that entraps. One asks you to think, the other asks you to obey. One challenges you to grow. The other comforts you into stagnation. In a world obsessed with spectacle, it takes strength to value substance. In a culture that rewards presence over depth, it takes courage to see past the surface. But that strength is yours. That courage belongs to you. It always has. It's just been waiting beneath the noise, beneath the excitement, beneath the echo of someone else's voice. You begin to walk differently. Not faster, not louder, but truer. You feel the pull of the charismatic, but you don't move until your conscience does. You hear the call of certainty, but you pause for the whisper of doubt. You see the shimmer of greatness, and you ask, does it cast a shadow? And this habit, this discipline of asking, reflecting, pausing becomes your protection, not against people, but against illusion, against the stories we so desperately want to be true. We no longer notice when they stop being real. Charisma crafts those stories beautifully. It makes life feel like destiny. It makes red flags look like passion. It makes control sound like care. But when you return to your own inner voice, you become harder to sway. Not closed, but discerning. Not cold, but clear. And that clarity changes how you listen, how you follow, how you lead. Because yes, one day, you too will be the one others look to. You will hold their trust. You will move their hearts. You will speak with conviction. And others will feel the echo of your words in their bones. And in that moment, remember this journey. Remember the weight of their attention. Remember the cost of their admiration. Do not become the mirror that swallows them whole. Become the mirror that reflects them back to themselves. Because that's what leadership truly is. Not the magnetism that draws others into your orbit, but the integrity that leads them back to their own. Not the voice that drowns theirs out, but the presence that awakens what they've forgotten. Not charisma that enchants, but character that endures. The world does not need more stars. It needs more beacons. The ones who shine not for attention, but for direction. The ones who point, not to themselves, but to truth, to freedom, to the strength that already lives inside those who follow. And so, the next time you feel that familiar pull, that surge of emotion, that awe, that longing pause, feel it, name it. Then ask the question that might just save you from surrendering. Is this awakening or is this abandonment? Because charisma, in its highest form, is a gift, but only when it meets discernment, only when it bows to truth, only when it lives in service, not of the self, but of something far greater. And if you've ever lost yourself to someone's magnetism, if you've ever walked too far in their name, silenced too many doubts, abandoned too many instincts, know this: you are not broken. You are not naive. You are not weak. You are simply human, reaching for light. But now you see, now you know, and now you return. Not bitter, not afraid, but wiser, stronger, whole, because the danger of charisma may be hidden, but the strength it awakens once recognized is yours to claim, to protect, and to live by, not just today, but every time you choose your voice over someone else's echo. And that choice, that quiet, radical, sacred choice is the most powerful charisma of all.